Migration is an act of survival. Malinali wished she could have relied on the likeness of butterflies and migrated on time, flown through the high skies far above the clouds, where she would not have to hear weeping and lamenting, where you could not distinguish the mutilated corpses, the rivers of blood, the smell of death. She wanted to flee before her eyes grew blind, before her heart froze and her spirit disconnected with her gods. Cortés had decided to move on and slaughter the inhabitants of Cholula, which he considered an act of self-defense. He wanted to prevent any act before he could be caught defenseless. He wanted to teach a lesson to the natives who were harboring thoughts against him and, at the same time, send a clear message to Montezuma. He brought together the lords of Cholula in the temple of Quetzalcoatl, under the pretext of saying his goodbyes and thanking them for their services. Malinali and Aguilar served as translators for the 3,000 men who came there. Once they were inside, the doors were closed. Cortés, on his horse, spoke powerfully, his voice like thunder, like the earth when it quakes. His figure, magnified by the height of his horse, was imposing. During the Middle Ages, only noblemen rode horses, and for that reason, Cortés, a plebeian, liked to give orders on his horse. It made him into a superior being, physically and socially speaking. Cortés chastised the Cholultecans for wanting to murder him when he had arrived in Cholula as a peacemaker, and the only thing he had done since that day was to warn them against the error of worshipping false idols, of committing acts of sodomy, and of performing human sacrifices. Malinali, when translating, tried to be true to his words, and so that everyone heard her, she raised her voice as much as possible. She spoke in the name of Malinche, a nickname they had given Cortés, since he always had her by his side. Malinche in some way meant the master of Malinali. Malinche is very upset. He wants to know if perhaps you want to sneak behind our backs. Do us the slithery, the stormy, and the deceitful. If you want to lay on us your shields, your clubs, when all Malinche did was come in peace, when all his words attempted to do was to speak to you of that which will expand your hearts? He who brings the word of our Lord never expected you to be plotting his murder. He who sees and knows all cannot ignore that in the outskirts of Cholula there are Mexica warriors ready to attack. The chiefs confessed to all, but justified their actions by saying they were only obeying orders from Montezuma. Cortés then mentioned the laws of the Spanish realm, where treason was punishable by death, and therefore the lords of Cholula deserved death. Malinali had not yet finished translating these last words when the discharge of a harquebus signaled the beginning of the slaughter. For over 2 hours, the Spaniards stabbed, beat, and murdered all the Indians who were gathered there. Malinali ran to a corner to hide, and with eyes filled with horror, watched Cortés and his soldiers sever arms, ears, and heads. The sound of the metal ripping through muscle and bone, the screams, the wailing terrorized her heart. The beautiful huipil that she was wearing was soon splattered with blood. Blood soaked the feathered crests, the clothes, and the mantles of the Cholultecans. It gathered in pools. Mortar and shotgun fire tore to pieces the terrorized multitude. No one could escape. No one could scale the walls. Defenseless, they were all murdered. When all the men gathered there had been killed, the doors to the courtyard were opened, and Malinali fled in terror. The 5,000 Tlaxcaltecans and the more than 400 Zempoalans allied with Cortés pillaged and plundered the city. Malinali dodged them and ran until she reached the river, horrified by the hatred with which they slaughtered men, women, and children. The temple of Huitzilopochtli, the god who represented Mexica dominion, was set on fire. The frenzy of murder, plunder, and blood lasted for 2 days until Cortés re-established order. A total of 6,000 Cholultecans perished. Cortés ordered the few priests who survived to watch the floors and walls, to rid the temples of idols, and in their place to install crosses and images of the Virgin Mary. According to Cortés, this horror was a good thing, so that all of the Indians could see and realize that their idols were false and deceitful, that they could not protect them adequately, because instead of being gods, they were demons. For Cortés, the conquest was a struggle of good against evil, of the true God against false gods, of superior beings against inferior beings. He thought that he had the sacred mission of saving all the Indians from the ignorance in which they lived, which, according to him, led them to commit all types of savage and uncivilized acts. The thousands of dismembered corpses, lifeless, purposeless, weighed heavily on Malinali's spirit. Her soul was no longer her own. It had been captured during the struggle by all those silent, defenseless, unspared bodies. No one, neither the troops of Spaniards nor the troops of natives, caused her any harm. No one damaged her body. No one wounded her. She was, however, dead, and she bore on her shoulders the weight of hundreds of the dead. Her eyes had no life in them. They no longer shone. Her breath could scarcely be felt. Her heartbeat was weak. She went a long while without moving a single muscle. She was freezing to death, but she wasn't the least bit motivated to cover herself with a blanket. Besides, she was sure that she would not be able to find a single one that was not covered with blood. The October cold penetrated her bones, her soul. She, who had always lived on the coast, blessed by the heat of the sun, was suffering from the change of temperature, but much more so by what her eyes had witnessed. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps jolted her. Her heart expected the worst. She turned around to see who it was that approached her and found Cortés's horse, alone without its master, approaching the river to drink. The horse also seemed frightened. Its legs were stained with blood. Malinali went to him and tried to clean them. The horse remained still, letting her do her work. When she was finished, Malinali caressed its head, looked into its large eyes, and saw her own fear reflected there. The same thing seemed to be happening to the horse. He looked at Malinali in an odd manner. Neither of them seemed to recognize each other, for they were no longer the same. Events had changed them. Malinali was no longer the girl-woman delighted to be baptized, whom the horse had seen some months back. That horse, who had been present at her rebirth during the baptism, had now been a witness to death. This was some other Malinali, some other river, some other Cholula, some other Cortés. Malinali remembered Cortés's hands, and she shuddered. She had seen the cruelty of those hands. She had seen how those hands that on the day before had caressed her were capable of killing with such resolve. She could never see him in the same way again. Nothing was the same, and there was no going back. What would come in response to this massacre that she herself felt responsible for? She had tried to justify herself, thinking that although she had not confided in Cortés about her conversation with the Cholultecan woman who had offered to flee with her son and Malinali before the Spaniards were wiped out, Cortés had found out about the plans by other means. Moreover, Cortés's allies had informed him, before she said anything, that hidden traps had been set up on the streets and pathways, with pointed stakes at the bottom to impale the horses, that some streets were bricked off, that they were stockpiling stones on the rooftop terraces, and that the women and children were being evacuated. The Tlaxcaltecans had also informed him that on the outskirts of the city there was a garrison of 15,000 to 20,000 of Montezuma's warriors gathered, something that was never confirmed. Only one fact remained. The Spaniards, along with the Tlaxcaltecans, had slaughtered more than 6,000 natives, and she could be next.